Alrighty, we are back with the last rendition or the last part of the um, internal authentication logs. This is going to be the more practical version of what I wanted to show you. This is going to bring up all of the knowledge we had learned thus far, and we are going to apply this to a brute force that I had sent across the wire. So I went ahead and I ran two different brute forces, but let's see what we see in the logs first. So let's say we get an alert that generates on our sim, and we see the following. So failed login for administrator from a Kali box at .4 using NTLM. Cool. As you can see, about every second, there's around 4 login attempts. And there's no way a user is cranking those out by themselves. So we're here, we're seeing a bunch of failed logons. I think this is unrelated, so this is another good case where filtering out information would be very useful, or filtering for information regarding the administrator account. So we're seeing a bunch of failed logins and stuff from the administrator account from the Kali box. Okay, cool. Still seeing the same thing, this time from administrator, and then this is from the administrator account. So quite a few failed attempts here. So as we go, we eventually see the account name change to Jill, and that's from the same source and protocol. Now, what does this mean to us? So if we have a way to visualize this, we would basically see on a graph that would look like this. So if this is the time of the brute force right here, it may look like this every so often. Like you have a login for the administrator account every so often, and then you would hit a giant spike in the middle, and then it would taper back down to what's normal for that user account. So a couple things that we can do here. So we definitely need to investigate this, and we're definitely going to use the source IP here to discern why exactly this is happening the way it is. Now, given that we know the IP address, we have to start talking to a few different teams here. We need to figure out what the MAC address of .1.4 is. Like where does this live? Is this a VPN IP? Is this just an IP from a user's workstation? Like what is going on? And the next thing we need to think about is okay, if we see this brute force happening and it's happening across some basic looking accounts, so we see the account name Jill being brute forced, we see the administrator account being brute forced from the same IP. Do we see any successful logins? So the last thing we're going to check is we're going to keep going through these logs. And if we had a sim, it would be a lot easier. We're going to try and find kind of towards the end, because usually when a brute force runs and it finds its mark, it can be programmed to stop or it can be programmed to keep going. But in this case, I know where it stopped and where it was successful. So in this case, we see a login. Let me get rid of the stuff on the screen. We see a login of 4776 from to the administrator account from the Kali box. And we see a network type login here. So it's showing that it was successful in its brute force. Now, given that we know this, there's a few things that we may have to do here. So as mentioned before, figure out where this box lives. We know there's a Kali box. It probably doesn't have any type of EDR agent on it because it's probably not one of our devices. We have options either to isolate. We can begin to isolate things. So I've seen some people, if they have their network set up in a way that's not flat, prevent the VPN IPs from talking to the internal network if they are segmented off before they RDP somewhere else. If we have some sort of host base or some sort of networking rules that allow blocking traffic from the IP or the MAC address, that could also work. But in general, this is one of the few alerts that can kind of tell you something really bad is going on, or it tells you that, or it's just like false positive all the time. So if you see brute force alerts kick off and they're always false positive, you probably want to look into suppressing these with your detections team. And I would say the way we can try and write these rules, or the rules that you may see when you triage this on the day to day. So as I mentioned before, there was a large spike right in the middle where everywhere else it was just kind of like one every so often. Now, in this case, what we may do, we may write a detection because we have 153 alerts. What if we write a detection where if we see 100 failed logins within a minute, we can go ahead and send an alert? Because what if our time frame is too large? What if within 24 hours, if we have 100 failed logins, then it fires the alert? Then it may not be useful as an alert because the time frame is so wide, it may not make any sense. So let me do a quick query for 4625s here. Let's look at these. So we had 200 failed logins within the span of, so we're starting at 128.44 and we're ending at 129.40. So basically 1 minute. We had 200 failed logins. Now, when you are triaging different types of authentication alerts, um, you, if you can, you want to try and understand the logic behind the alert because sometimes you have poorly tuned alerts where they're written in a way that it's always false positive and it's just catching everything. But the way we can go about triaging these, even if you have a poorly tuned alert, we got a couple options. Have we seen this IP perform this activity in the past? Given like it doesn't even have to be the same username. Like, do we know, for example, is this like a cache credential on a user endpoint and it keeps trying to authenticate for whatever reason? That is completely different from something like this, where we see the activity spike randomly here. So it would look like, it's here, it's here, it's here, it's here, and then it spikes here. So you would see some sort of a graph that does this thing. Whereas if you have cache credentials for a user, you may end up seeing something like this. You have a graph, it's just very consistent across like 7 days or however long that they've been having credential issues. And in your graph inherently is just kind of flat. Depending on what kind of rules you have, you gotta have to get creative with how you're gonna triage them, get creative with what you already know about the device, and go from there. In this case, if I saw something like this, either it's a low and slow brute force for 7 days, which would be very surprising because usually there's additional IOCs that accompany a brute force. Um, I'm more likely to alert on something that does a giant spike at a random interval. So think those are things to keep in mind. And especially if you are interviewing, this may be something that you get asked in an interview question. It's like, okay, well, you see 100 or 200 brute force, or you see 100 or 246.25s. What do you do? And the question is going to be left vague intentionally because they may be trying to test you for additional parameters of that question. So they're saying, hey, there's 200 failed logins. We'll just say FL. There's 200 failed logins. What do you do? And if you jump immediately and you say, oh, yeah, that's suspicious, you didn't ask enough questions. You don't have enough data to make this assumption. Now, if you go back to the interview and you're like, hey, what are the time frame of the alerts? Is it the same account? Is it like a bunch of different accounts? What are the frequency of the failed logins per account? Stuff like that will help you determine your answer. If they come back and say, oh, it was 200 failed logins over 365 days. Okay, well, without further context, it sounds pretty benign because even if you just failed your password once a day or once every couple days, you're going to hit 200 pretty quick. If they said 200 failed logins within 30 seconds, you have a different spike on your hands and you need to figure out the source IP and if that's expected or not. Few different caveats to there, but in essence, you need to know when to investigate and when to say, hey, this alert needs a little bit of tuning. So that's it for the internal authentication series until I find something wrong with what I said, which will probably be soon. I'll come back and correct it. But with that being said, I think the next set of videos I want to make are externally facing or externally sourced login failures. For example, instead of seeing all these relative to the internal network, so we see all the login fails come from the .1.4 device, which is internal, Sometimes you'll see the source network of these failed logins from a firewall, from a server that has some sort of web facing logon. Um, you may even see it from an open VPN. It could be anything, and you could even have RDP open to the internet, and the source port may actually point you to 3389, and the source network address may be external. That lab is going to take a little longer to create, but I think it's also quite useful if we're talking about internal versus external here. So until then, take it easy, and I will catch you on the flip side.